Okay, we left off in the last video looking at this equation, the one for using the geometric growth rate to calculate the size of a population at some point in the future, and I had said for you to um, base it on a starting population size of 100, a lambda of 1.2, and we're going to do 10 years or 10 increments into the future. And so what are we going to get? Well, let's see, 1.2 to the 10th times 100. When you get that, you should get approximately, if we round it, 619 individuals. So in that 10-year increment, we'll go from 100 to 619 with a lambda of 1.2. So again, lambda represents the geometric growth rate. It's another way to look at this kind of growth, and we can characterize it as exponential growth. Which is based on the value of r, which is the exponential population growth rate. So lambda and r are similar, related variables, but there's a slight difference in that geometric growth is based on very discrete incremental time units, whereas exponential growth is a function that gives you continuous, it gives you what the continuous or instantaneous rate of growth is. And so it will lead to this nice, smooth, upward sloping curve that we think of and know of as exponential growth. Now, how can we use the exponential population growth rate to calculate the size of the population at some time in the future? Well, we can use this equation here to do that. Now, what is the relationship between the geometric growth rate and the exponential growth rate? Essentially, there are these equations right here. Lambda is basically equal to the exponent of r, or vice versa, r is equal to the log of lambda. And one thing we should take note of here is that when we have exponential growth, like this, you notice it's on this absolute linear scale here. When we put it on a log scale, exponential growth exhibits a straight line moving up from the bottom left to the upper right. Keep that in mind. We'll revisit that just a little bit. So, lambda and r. Lambda, a value of 1 is no growth or just a constant population size. An exponential growth rate of 0 gives you the same result. Okay, keep that in mind. So a shrinking population has a lambda less than 1 or an r less than 0, and a growing population has a lambda greater than 1 and an r greater than 0. Another formula, we can also calculate the doubling time of the population based on the exponential growth rate. Essentially, in how many years or time units will that population double in size? And another one, we can also calculate the net reproductive rate. And you recall from life tables that these values are survivorship and fecundity. So for all stages in the life table, let's go back and look at the life table. Here we go. So you got all these different stages. Essentially, if you just multiply survivorship by fecundity at all stages, and then take the sum of those, you will get the net reproductive rate overall for that population. Okay, so limits to population growth. Well, indeed there are. We talked a little bit already about, of course, there can be abiotic factors like the weather, climate, things like that. And then, of course, you can have biotic factors. What would be some biotic factors that can control population growth? Of course, your food supply, predators, disease. Those are some good ones that can limit the growth of populations. Okay, let's move on to section 4. So when we think of limits to population, we can classify them into sort of two main types. There's what's called density dependent and density independent. And so we're asked this question, is lambda always greater than 1? Do populations just continuously grow? I think we've answered that question as an emphatic no. But, and we went through some of the biotic and abiotic things, but let's classify them in a somewhat different way. So, when we talk about density independent factors, we mean those are factors that will limit the size of the population regardless of the size or density of that population. It doesn't matter whether it's low density or high density population. And so here's an example where it appears that weather is what's restricting this particular insect called a thrip. And so it really doesn't matter how many individuals are present, it's just how warm or how cold essentially the year is, and some other variables. This was a study that took in many different weather-related variables, and so they created a model, and they had the predictions from the model and then the actual data, and you can see there's a pretty good fit between the two sets. All right, so density independent. So essentially a population growth rate when it comes to density independent factors is not related to density. The growth rate is not related at all. But when you have density dependent factors, the population density has an impact on the growth rate. That is, when you get to higher density populations, the population growth rate comes down. And so as we mentioned at the end of that last section, of course, what's going to do that, what's going to influence these, what's going to cause these density-dependent declines in reproduction or population size? Well, food's a good one. So in this study of these birds, I think a type of sparrow, we see that as the number of breeding females increases, you generally have this sloping curve downward. There's one anomalous year when the population wasn't that large, but they didn't do so well reproductively. But for the most part, you can see as population increases, the number of breeding females, the reproductive output decreases. And they studied this particular in '85, as you can see, which appeared to be a very high population, bad year for reproductive output, but they had some individuals in this population that they supplemented their food, and those particular individuals had lots of offspring, lots of babies. So very clear evidence that food was playing an example here. Here's soybeans, not necessarily a natural system, but an agricultural system. And they varied the planting density. I mean, it's how many seeds they sowed per meter squared in a field. And then they looked at, okay, of all those seeds they sowed, how many basically grew? And so with 100% survival, those two should be equal. That is, when you plant 50, you should get 50 plants. And you can see at very low densities, the data basically follows that line, but as you get to greater and greater densities, the survivorship begins to drop off. That is, even though you planted 100, you only have, I don't know, maybe 90 some odd plants that survive. When you get up to 1,000, you can see you only get 100. So there seems to be a limit to how many plants this field can support. So it doesn't matter if you keep increasing how many seeds you sow, there's only so many that can live there. And that, it's a plant, so what's that related to? It could be related to nutrients in the soil, it could be related to water. Again, these things that limit the number of plants that can survive. Here's the flower beetle. Another example, again, you can see as the egg density in these experimental tubes increases, mortality increases, so having a negative impact on population size. Poa annua, this weedy grass, increasing density, again, with decreasing population growth rate. Again, there's only so much space and resources in the soil. So that will limit the size of that population. Another example, lots of examples here, Daphnia pulex. This is an aquatic organism known as the water flea. It's a small type of, it's essentially related to crustaceans. And they're not quite microscopic. You can see them, but they're very small. And so you can see when you have an aquatic system density increasing, the growth rate slows down. So some good examples there. All right, let's start logistic growth, see if we finish it on this video. Okay, so because we have these factors, in particular these density-dependent factors that limit the size of a population, populations have what we call a carrying capacity, or a limit to the size of a population. All right, and so population might start out relatively small. It can go through a period of rapid growth, perhaps exponential growth, but you ultimately reach the carrying capacity and that population levels off. So we have what we call the logistic equation. And the logistic equation essentially is a mathematical expression of this type of curve. And so we have our exponential rate of increase, number of individuals, but now we factor in K, and for whatever reason, I'm not sure exactly why, the carrying capacity is abbreviated as K. And so there's our exponential growth equation, our logistic growth equation, and we get these different outcomes when we factor in the carrying capacity. Let's look at this equation for just a second. So we essentially have the exponential equation here, but then we have this other part we put in. And so let's think about this. So if we have a carrying capacity of, say, 1,000, but we only have 100 individuals in the population at the current moment, essentially this side of the equation is going to be 0.9, okay? But what happens as that population gets closer and closer to 1,000, and eventually it reaches 1,000? Well, then of course this side of the equation becomes 0, so all of this side becomes 0, so essentially the population is not growing at that point. So as you get closer and closer to the carrying capacity, this side of the equation gets closer and closer to 0, and the population is no longer growing. Okay. All right, so now, what's the carrying capacity of the United States? Well, back in the 20s, these folks did a study. And they essentially derived the logistic equation, the logistic curve, and they applied it to the U.S. population. And the red dots represent known data at that time, the known population size. And they used the equation to calculate what the population growth rate would be and what would the carrying capacity would be into the future. And so they had estimated that the U.S. carrying capacity of the United States for people was somewhat under 200 million, about 187 million, I think it said. Now you can see early on, up to about the 50s, their predicted line, the subsequent data, the green dots, fit up to the 1950s. But then what they predicted, when they predicted a leveling off, it actually just kept on increasing. So think for a moment, what essentially happened in the post-World War II years, 50s, 60s, 70s, and on, that made it such that their prediction no longer fit? What conditions in the world and the United States changed that allowed for a much larger population? I'm going to let you think about that. We'll talk about it in class. Now, we sometimes think of, and we looked at a figure way back at the beginning, that we said, oh, this is the U.S., the world population of people is exhibiting logistic or exponential growth. Well, actually, as we mentioned earlier, when you have exponential growth, where is it? Somewhere around here. When you have exponential growth and you put it on a log scale, you get a straight line. But what we've actually seen in the world population is a population on a log scale exceeding